That morning felt completely ordinary. Nobody in the office suspected that this routine meeting would turn into a moment everyone would remember for years. The air was calm, almost boring. People were shuffling papers, typing short emails, sipping their coffees in slow, automatic motions. No one was prepared for what was about to happen. Steve sat quietly near the end of the long conference table. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look angry. He simply observed the room the way he always did. Calm, collected, focused. But something felt off to him. There was a tension he couldn't ignore. A quiet uneasiness that hung in the air like dust caught in a beam of light. Across the table sat Mark. Usually confident, even loud, he looked strangely pale that morning, as if he hadn't slept, as if he was carrying a weight he could barely hold. Steve noticed this immediately. He always noticed things like that. Small details, tiny shifts in behavior, things most people would overlook. The meeting began just like any other. The manager greeted everyone. Slides appeared on the screen. Numbers, deadlines, tasks, updates. Nothing unusual, until the moment the manager asked about the status of the project that had been stressing the entire team for weeks. He looked at Mark and said, "Mark, can you give us a quick overview of where we stand?" And that's when everything changed. Mark cleared his throat. He tried to sound steady. He tried to look confident, but his voice wavered, barely noticeable, yet unmistakable. And then he said the words that instantly drained the room of every last trace of casual office energy. He said, "Well, we're behind schedule, because Steve didn't deliver his part on time." A silence fell so quickly it was almost violent. People turned their heads towards Steve as if pulled by invisible strings. A few pens stopped moving mid-sentence. Someone shifted nervously in their chair. The manager raised his eyebrows, surprised. It was an accusation. Direct, cold, public, and completely unexpected. Steve didn't react immediately. For a moment, he simply blinked. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't shock. It was something else. He was deciding how he wanted to respond. He could have snapped back. He could have defended himself aggressively. He could have stood up and turned the room into a battlefield. But he didn't. Instead, he slowly lifted his head, looked straight at Mark, and spoke with a voice so calm that it made the accusation sound even more reckless. He said, "Mark, are you sure you want to talk about this here? Right now?" The room grew even quieter. Some employees leaned back. Some leaned forward. Everyone could feel that Steve wasn't denying anything. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't intimidated. He was inviting the truth into the room, and that terrified Mark, far more than any angry reaction could have. Mark tried to maintain his composure. He straightened his back. He lifted his chin. He raised his voice just a little, trying to reclaim control. He said, "Yes, Steve, I think we should talk about it. Everyone deserves to know why the project is falling apart." A few people exchanged uneasy glances. Something wasn't right. The tone, the insistence, the way Mark's voice cracked at the edge of every sentence. Steve exhaled slowly. He pushed his chair back, stood up calmly without haste, and rested his hands on the table. And then he said, "All right, let's talk about it." That simple phrase, spoken so quietly, sent a shiver through the room, because everyone knew Steve never raised his voice. He never argued unless he had facts. Cold, undeniable facts. Mark looked more uncomfortable by the second, but he tried to push forward. He accused Steve of delaying files, of ignoring reminders, of refusing to follow up. His voice grew louder, more desperate, but something about his words felt thin, like he was reading from a script he didn't believe in. And Steve finally responded, not with anger, not with frustration, but with absolute clarity. He said, "I sent the calculations 2 days before the deadline. You know that. You asked for an extension, and you didn't tell the team. Do you really want to pretend that didn't happen?" The transformation in the room was instant. You could almost hear the air freeze. Someone held their breath. Someone else whispered, "Oh God," under their breath. Mark's face lost all color. He blinked quickly, as if trying to decide whether to keep lying or beg for mercy. But Steve wasn't finished. He added, "If you want to talk about responsibility, Mark, then let's be honest. Not loud, just honest." The word honest echoed in the silence like a hammer hitting metal. Mark inhaled sharply, ready to fire back, but his voice faltered. His next words got stuck in his throat, and everyone in the room could feel it. Steve knew something. Something big. Something Mark didn't want anyone to hear. And the real moment of truth was still ahead. The room was holding its breath. People could feel something shifting, slowly but inevitably, like the beginning of a storm. Everyone's eyes were fixed on Mark and Steve. Nobody dared to interrupt. Mark swallowed hard. He tried to recover, to regain control, to rebuild the confidence that had already started collapsing. He took a step forward and said, "I only asked for that extension because the numbers you sent were incomplete. I had to fix your mistakes." His voice cracked on the last sentence, not dramatically, just enough for everyone to hear the fear hiding behind the accusation. Steve didn't look shaken. He didn't look offended. He looked disappointed, not with himself, not even with Mark, but with the entire situation. He leaned forward slightly and said, "The numbers were complete, Mark. Every single part. You know it, I know it. Our manager knows it. And the timestamp on the file knows it too." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Someone exhaled a quiet breath that sounded almost like a gasp. The truth was no longer a theory in the room. It was becoming a presence, a force. Mark took another deep breath. He raised his voice again, almost shouting, "Stop pretending you're perfect, Steve. Everyone here knows you work slower than the rest of us. Everyone knows you hold the team back." That was the moment something snapped in the room. Not loudly, not visibly, just snapped. Because it wasn't true. Everyone knew it wasn't true. And accusing someone of something blatantly false is like lighting a match in a room filled with gasoline fumes. Steve didn't match Mark's volume. He didn't move. He simply said, with the same calm tone, "If you truly believe that, then explain why you used my numbers. Explain why the version you sent to the client was copied from my file. Explain why your fix changed the totals and created a $2,000 inconsistency." Another silence. This one even heavier. Some people looked at Mark with confusion, others with fear, a few with a kind of quiet, horrified curiosity. The kind you feel when watching a slow-motion accident you can't stop. Mark tried to speak, but nothing came out. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Still nothing. Steve waited, patiently, not mocking, not triumphant, just waiting. And then he asked the question that pushed the entire room into deeper, colder silence. "Mark, what exactly were you trying to hide?" It was like a stone hitting a frozen lake. The entire surface cracked at once. People glanced at each other, then at the manager, then at Mark. He looked like someone whose world had just collapsed. Eyes wide, hands shaking, breathing uneven. Still, he tried to defend himself. He whispered, "You don't understand. I just wanted the project to look better. I didn't mean to cause any problems." Steve's voice softened, not with sympathy, but with clarity. "You changed the financial summary, Mark. You altered the totals. You made it look like the client would save money, but they wouldn't. And you know that." Mark's lips trembled. "It was a small correction," he tried to say. But Steve didn't let him escape that easily. "No, it wasn't a correction. It was a cover-up. You made a mistake in your initial calculations, and instead of admitting it, you changed the numbers. Then you blamed me for the delay." The entire room felt the truth land like a physical weight. Mark staggered back a step, one step only, but it was enough. A step backward speaks louder than 100 excuses. The manager finally spoke, his voice low, controlled, but sharp. "Mark, is this accurate?" For a moment, nobody moved. It felt like even time itself had stopped to listen. Mark couldn't hide anymore. His shoulders sagged, his head lowered, his voice broke. "Yes," he whispered. "I made the mistake." A wave of tension rolled through the room. Some people shook their heads. Some looked away. Some stared at Steve with newfound respect. But Steve didn't show satisfaction. He didn't smile. He didn't even nod. He simply said, "That's all I wanted. The truth." These 4 words hung in the air like the final note of a song. Clear, simple, undeniable. And the silence that followed was the deepest the room had ever known. It wasn't the silence of shock anymore. It was the silence of realization, of consequences, of respect. Steve didn't raise his voice once. He didn't insult anyone. He didn't humiliate Mark. He let the truth speak for him, and the truth was louder than any argument could ever be. Steve took a slow breath. steadying himself. The room felt different now, still tense, still silent, but no longer hostile. It was as if everyone had shifted, collectively and subconsciously, into a listening posture. Whatever would be said next mattered. Steve looked around, scanning the faces. Some eyes were wide, some narrowed in thought, some genuinely curious. It struck him that the room wasn't waiting for the next argument. They were waiting for clarity. He stepped forward. "All right," Steve said quietly. "If what you're saying is true, then let's test it." The colleague Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Test it how?" Steve gestured to the entire room. "Let's ask them. No preconditions. No framing. Just one simple question." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Even the moderator sat up straighter. Daniel crossed his arms. "Go on." Steve walked toward the center of the room, turning slowly, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "I want every person here to answer internally. Don't say it out loud. Don't gesture. Don't raise hands. Just think." Silence reclaimed the room, thicker than before. Steve continued. "When was the last time you truly changed your mind because you discovered you had been wrong?" The words hovered in the air, ghost-like, heavy. No one moved. Not a single cough. Not a pen click. Just stillness. Seconds stretched. 10, 15, 20. People began shifting slightly, but not from impatience, from introspection. Steve watched them. The small reactions were enough. Eyes lowering, brows tightening, lips pressing together. Every person was processing something personal. After nearly 30 seconds of uninterrupted quiet, Steve glanced at Daniel. Daniel wasn't smiling anymore. He wasn't annoyed. He wasn't argumentative. He was thinking, just thinking. Steve approached him slowly. "That's why we get stuck," Steve said softly. "Not because of the facts, not because of the evidence, but because admitting we were wrong feels like losing." Daniel exhaled, a long, tired breath, the kind someone releases when they hear a truth they've avoided for a long time. "Maybe," Daniel said quietly. "Maybe it's not just losing. Maybe it feels like giving up a piece of ourselves." The room reacted not with sound, but with a subtle, collective inhale. It was the first moment Daniel had spoken with vulnerability instead of certainty. Steve nodded. "And maybe," he responded, "that's why your answer earlier stunned everyone. You changed not just your stance, you changed your view of yourself, and that's rare." Daniel swallowed hard. "So what do we do?" he asked. "How do we keep from locking ourselves into old beliefs?" Steve turned once more to the crowd. "We start," he said, "by focusing less on winning and more on understanding, less on defending and more on listening, less on proving we're right, and more on discovering the truth, even if it contradicts what we wanted." A faint hum of agreement moved through the room, quiet but unmistakable. Steve looked back at Daniel. "And we normalize being wrong, because being wrong isn't the opposite of being smart. Being wrong is the first step toward being better." Daniel let out another breath, this one lighter. "You know," he said slowly, "I didn't expect this from you." "Neither did I," Steve replied with a half-smile. "But here we are." Daniel extended his hand. Steve shook it, and the room, which had held its breath for what felt like hours, finally exhaled. A wave of relief, warmth, and unexpected unity swept the space. But then, just as Steve was about to step back, a voice rose from the far side of the room. "Wait," a woman said. Her tone was steady, curious, but sharp, like she was about to peel back a layer no one had noticed yet. Steve froze. Daniel turned. The entire room shifted toward the voice. The woman, tall, with dark hair, pulled into a loose knot, stood up, holding a small notebook. "I want to ask something," she said. "Something both of you might find uncomfortable." Steve's pulse flickered. She continued, "You've talked about admitting when we're wrong. But what about when we're right and still ignored? What about when people don't listen even when the truth is in front of them? What do you do then?" A new silence fell, but this one was sharper, more electric, more dangerous. Steve opened his mouth to answer, but Daniel raised a hand. "No," Daniel said. "Let him answer. I want to hear it too." Steve stared at the woman. Her question wasn't simple. It wasn't safe. It wasn't rhetorical. It carried a weight that hinted at history, experience, frustration, maybe even pain. The entire room leaned in. Steve took a breath. And then he answered. "You keep telling the truth," he said, "even if no one hears it at first, because truth doesn't need applause. It just needs time." The woman studied him, really studied him, before slowly sitting down. But something had changed again. A deeper layer of tension surfaced in the room. Quiet, invisible, but potent, because everyone there knew. This conversation wasn't finished, not even close. Steve felt it too, and the next question, the one forming unspoken in nearly every mind, would be the one that broke the silence completely, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. Steve felt the pressure rising again, slow, invisible, but undeniable. The earlier breakthrough, the handshake, the moment of unity. It all seemed fragile now, as if one wrong word could shatter the entire room. He looked around. People were leaning forward in their seats, eyes fixed on him with a strange mixture of anticipation and apprehension. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was hungry. Steve took a deep breath. "What's the real question everyone here is afraid to ask?" he finally said. The room reacted. Some stiffened, some looked away. But no one spoke. Steve stepped toward the center. "Because there is a question," he continued. "I can feel it. You can feel it. And until someone says it out loud, we're all just circling around it." A man near the front shifted uncomfortably. A woman scribbled something in a notebook, then immediately crossed it out. Someone coughed, the sound echoing too loudly in the tense space. Steve waited, and waited. And then someone stood, a young man near the back, nervous, hands trembling slightly, but determined. His voice cracked at first, but he forced the words through anyway. "All right, I'll ask it." Dozens of heads turned toward him. He swallowed hard. What if the truth isn't enough? A murmur rippled through the room. The air seemed to change temperature. The young man continued, voice gaining strength. "What if the truth is clear and obvious and proven, but people still refuse to accept it? What if logic isn't the problem? What if the real problem is people don't want the truth because it doesn't benefit them?" A heavy, uneasy silence descended. Steve stared at him, really seeing him now. This wasn't just curiosity. This was frustration sharpened into despair. Daniel exhaled loudly. "That's a fair question," he admitted. "Uncomfortable, but fair." The young man nodded, emboldened. "So what then?" he asked. "Do we just keep talking to walls? Do we pretend everything's fine while people choose whatever version of reality makes them feel good?" His voice rose, not in anger, but in urgency, because sometimes it feels like truth doesn't stand a chance, not in arguments, not in discussions, not anywhere. Steve let the words settle before he spoke. His voice was calm, measured, but firm. "You're right," he said. "Sometimes truth isn't enough." The room reacted with a collective jolt. Steve continued, "Because truth alone doesn't change people. Truth needs something else." The young man frowned. "What?" "Courage," Steve said quietly, "and patience, and repetition, and consistency, and sometimes consequences." Daniel turned his head slightly, listening more closely. Steve walked a slow circle as he spoke, choosing each word with care. "People don't reject truth because it's false," he said. "They reject it because it threatens their comfort, their identity, their worldview. Accepting truth can mean accepting personal responsibility, and that scares people more than being wrong." He paused, letting the idea sink in. "But here's the part most people overlook," he added. "Truth doesn't have to win instantly. It just has to endure. It just has to exist long enough to be undeniable." The young man sat down slowly, absorbing every word. But someone else stood up before the silence could settle again. A middle-aged woman, confident posture, sharp eyes. She spoke almost immediately, not waiting for permission. "Truth might endure," she said, "but people don't. People burn out. People give up. People get exhausted when nobody listens." Her voice cracked, barely noticeable, but enough. "And what then?" she asked softly. "What do you tell the ones who did care, who did fight, who did speak up, and paid the price for it?" Steve felt a sting in his chest. This wasn't theoretical for her. This was personal. He approached her gently, not wanting to overpower her moment. "You tell them," he said slowly, "that truth doesn't always reward immediately. Sometimes it demands something from us before it gives anything back. The woman looked down. Her knuckles were white around the pen she held. Steve continued, "You tell them they're not alone, that every meaningful change in history started with someone who spoke truth long before anyone wanted to hear it." The woman looked up again, eyes brighter, not softer. "But what do you tell them?" she asked. "You personally, Steve. Not as an idea, not as a concept. What do you tell someone who's tired of being ignored?" Steve didn't hesitate. "I tell them," he said, "that being ignored doesn't make them wrong. It makes them early." A long pause. Then a few people in the room exhaled, loudly, involuntarily, like they had been holding their breath for minutes. The woman sat down slowly. Steve stepped back. But then Daniel, a man who had been quiet for a while now, spoke up again. His tone was softer than before, more thoughtful, more vulnerable. "Steve," he said, "I think you're missing something." Steve turned. "Missing what?" Daniel stepped closer. "You're talking about truth like it's this powerful, unstoppable force, something that eventually wins, something eternal." "It is," Steve said. Daniel shook his head. "No, not always. Sometimes the truth loses. Sometimes lies spread faster. Sometimes people choose the easier path." He paused. "And sometimes, Steve, sometimes truth needs defenders." The room froze again. Daniel continued, voice barely above a whisper. "Truth doesn't survive by itself. It survives because someone brave keeps it alive." Steve didn't move. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice but making sure the room could still hear. "And that," he said, "is why your answer earlier shook the entire room. Because you weren't just debating. You were protecting something bigger than winning an argument." Steve felt a strange sensation, like the room had suddenly narrowed around him. Daniel looked him in the eyes. "But here's the real question, Steve," he said quietly. "The one I want to ask you." The room stilled completely. Steve braced himself. Daniel's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Why do you care so much about the truth?" The question hit the room like a sudden temperature drop. Chairs creaked, fabric rustled, breaths caught. Every eye locked onto Steve. The question wasn't philosophical. It wasn't theoretical. It was personal, dangerously personal. The kind of question that exposed something real. Steve opened his mouth to answer, and stopped, because he realized he didn't know if he was ready to say the real reason out loud. Not yet. Not to them. Not here. Not to Daniel. But the room was waiting. And silence. Silence was no longer an option. Steve felt dozens of eyes pressing against him, waiting, pulling the truth out of him by sheer collective force. Daniel's question hovered in the air, sharp enough to cut. "Why do you care so much about the truth?" Steve's heartbeat slowed. Not sped up. Slowed. The way it does when the body recognizes a moment with consequences. He looked at Daniel, then at the audience, then back at Daniel. "It's not a simple answer," Steve said quietly. Daniel folded his arms. "No meaningful answer ever is." Steve let out a breath steady, controlled, but undeniably heavier than the ones before it. "Fine," he said. "You want the real reason?" The room leaned in as one. Steve looked down for a moment, then lifted his gaze again. "It's because," he said slowly, "I spent too many years believing lies. My own lies. Other people's lies. Lies that were comfortable, convenient. Lies that felt good to believe." He took a few steps toward the center of the room. "I trusted people who didn't deserve it. I trusted myself when I shouldn't have. And the worst part?" He paused. "I defended those lies. I fought for them. I argued with people who tried to help me. I ignored warning signs that were practically glowing." The room went silent again, this time with a more emotional weight. Steve continued, "And then one day, I realized that the truth had been right in front of me the whole time, and I had been too afraid to face it." Daniel's expression softened. Steve's voice dropped lower. "Ever since then, I promised myself I wouldn't run from the truth again. Not mine. Not anyone else's." He paused. "And I promised I wouldn't let other people fall into the same trap if I could help it." A few people shifted, some nodding instinctively. But Steve wasn't done. "Because lies," he said, "don't break suddenly. They break slowly. They erode you piece by piece until you don't even recognize yourself anymore." Then he added, almost quietly, "And I nearly didn't recognize myself. The room absorbed the confession like a sponge absorbing water. Steve saw something shift in Daniel's face. Respect, maybe, or understanding. Something more human than anything that had passed between them earlier. Daniel stepped forward. "What was the lie?" he asked gently. "The biggest one." Steve hesitated. He didn't want to answer, but he knew he had to. The room was too invested, the moment too real to retreat now. Finally, he spoke. "The lie was that I was always right." A ripple moved through the crowd, small gasps, a few surprised smiles, some raised eyebrows. Steve continued, voice steady. "I thought being confident meant being correct. I thought being loud meant being strong. I thought admitting I was wrong made me weak." He shook his head. "But I was wrong about all of it." Daniel let out a soft exhale. "So that's why," he murmured. "That's why you fight so hard for clarity. Why you pause instead of react. Why you ask questions instead of throwing punches." Steve nodded. "Yes, because I learned the hard way that the truth doesn't need a warrior. It needs a witness." The room reacted not loudly, but unmistakably. Something like agreement. Something like understanding. But then a voice pierced the quiet. "But what if the truth hurts someone you care about?" A new person stood, an older man this time. Grey hair, calm eyes, but a sorrow in his expression that suggested he wasn't asking a hypothetical. Steve turned toward him. The older man continued, "What if telling the truth means breaking someone's trust, ruining a relationship, hurting someone who's done nothing wrong except believe in you?" The question echoed through the room like a slow-moving wave. Steve felt a knot form in his throat. This wasn't philosophy. This wasn't debate. This was the raw, painful core of truth itself. Steve took a slow breath. "Then," he said gently, "you choose the kind of pain." The older man blinked, confused. Steve explained, "Because there are two types of pain, the pain of the truth and the pain of living without it." He took a step toward the man. "Truth hurts once. Lies hurt repeatedly." A murmur of recognition moved through the room. Steve continued, "If you hide the truth to protect someone, you're not protecting them. You're delaying the moment when the truth hits them even harder. Because when they finally learn it, and they always do, they won't just feel the truth. They'll feel betrayed." The older man looked down, swallowing hard. Steve softened his voice. "Pain isn't always the enemy. Sometimes it's the teacher." The man slowly sat back down. Daniel stepped forward again. "Steve," he said, "you said something earlier, that truth needs defenders." Steve nodded. "Yes." Daniel's eyes narrowed, but not in anger, more in careful thought. "So let me ask you this," he said. "Do you see yourself as one of those defenders?" The question landed with weight heavier than the previous ones. Steve froze. He hadn't expected that. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the room, dozens of faces watching him. Not hostile, not judgmental, but searching, waiting. "Do I see myself as a defender of truth?" Steve repeated quietly. He took a slow breath. "I don't know." Daniel stepped closer. "Why not?" Steve looked him straight in the eyes. "Because I think I'm still learning how to defend myself." A deep, resonant silence filled the room. Daniel's expression shifted, surprise, then understanding, then something like empathy. But before he could respond, a voice from the far side of the room spoke again, this time firm, clear, unapologetic. "So what happens next, Steve?" The question wasn't emotional. It wasn't philosophical. It was practical, grounded, direct. Everyone turned toward the speaker, a woman with sharp eyes and a posture that radiated leadership. "What do we do with all of this?" she asked. "What do you do with all of this?" Steve felt the question land inside him like a stone dropping into deep water. What now? What came after all this honesty, all this tension, all this vulnerability? He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Then, slowly, "I think what happens next is the part everyone avoids." The woman tilted her head. "And what part is that?" Steve looked around the room one more time. "The part," he said, "where we stop talking about truth and start acting like it matters." The room didn't explode into noise. It didn't erupt in applause or commentary. Instead, Steve's words settled over the crowd like a weight, quiet, heavy, and impossible to ignore. "Start acting like it matters." That sentence seemed to echo, bouncing from wall to wall, sinking into every person present. Daniel was the first to break the silence. "All right," he said cautiously. "Let's say you're right. Let's say we do start acting like it matters. What does that actually look like?" Steve expected the question. He'd asked himself the same thing many times. "It looks like responsibility," Steve answered. "Not the comfortable kind that lets us feel good about ourselves, but the difficult kind." He took a slow step forward. "It means admitting when we speak out of emotion instead of understanding. It means listening when it's easier to argue. It means changing our minds even when it bruises our pride." Someone in the back muttered, "Easier said than done." Steve nodded. "Of course it is. Everything meaningful is harder in practice, but that doesn't make it impossible." The woman who had asked, "What happens next?" raised her hand again. "But Steve," she said, "even if we want to act on truth, what if we don't know how? What if we don't have the tools or the confidence?" Steve considered her question carefully. "The first step," he began, "is learning to recognize when we're choosing comfort over clarity." He pointed loosely at the crowd. "We've all done it. Some of us are doing it right now." A few people averted their eyes. Steve continued, "The second step is creating an environment where people can be wrong without being humiliated. Because no one tells the truth if the punishment for honesty is shame." Daniel nodded at that. "And the third step," Steve said, "is realizing that truth is not a weapon. It's a responsibility." That line hit the room hard. A few people straightened in their seats. One person scribbled it into their notebook so fast the pen nearly tore the paper. Daniel circled around Steve, not aggressively, but thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "earlier today, if someone asked me what I thought of you, I would have called you stubborn." Steve huffed out a faint, amused breath. "You wouldn't be wrong." Daniel smirked slightly. "But now I see—" He paused. "Maybe it's not stubbornness. Maybe it's conviction." Steve didn't answer. The compliment felt unfamiliar, like trying on a coat that didn't quite belong to him yet. A young woman near the front raised her hand tentatively. "So, Steve," she said softly, "if truth requires action, then what action are you taking? Today. Right now. In this room." The room sharpened again, focused, alert. It was a fair question, a demanding question. Steve took a breath. "The action I'm taking," he said steadily, "is refusing to let this conversation end at words." He scanned the faces in the room. We've all been part of discussions like this before. Passionate, intense, meaningful. He paused. And then we go home and forget everything we said. A few people shifted uncomfortably. We convince ourselves that talking about change is enough, that thinking deeply for an hour counts as transformation. But it doesn't. It never has. His tone sharpened, not with anger, but with urgency. "So I'm asking you all one thing. Only one." He held up a single finger. "Do not leave this room and walk back into your old patterns. Do not let this conversation fade into a memory. Do not let this moment be wasted." The older man from earlier leaned forward. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" he asked. Steve's answer came without hesitation. "Hold yourself accountable." He took 2 steps toward the center, grounding himself. "When you're wrong, admit it. When someone else is right, acknowledge it. When you feel the urge to defend your ego, pause. When you want to shout, listen. When the truth is uncomfortable, face it anyway." The young man from Part 4 lifted his hand. "But Steve, what if I fail at that? What if I try and slip back into the same old habits?" Steve smiled, not with superiority, but with understanding. "You will." The young man blinked. "You will fail," Steve repeated gently. "We all will. Because truth isn't a destination. It's maintenance. Ongoing. Never done." He took another step. "It's not about perfection. It's about intention and effort and the willingness to try again when you slip." The young man exhaled, almost in relief. Daniel stepped closer. "So your point is," he said slowly, "we don't need to be flawless. We just need to be honest, especially with ourselves." Steve nodded. "That's it. That's all it is." The room absorbed the simplicity of that idea. It wasn't grand. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was real. A middle-aged woman in the 3rd row raised her voice. "Steve," she said, "all of this, it's powerful. But it also feels like it's building toward something. A question you still haven't answered." Steve frowned slightly. "What question?" She tilted her head. "What does the truth cost you?" The room tensed. It was a sharper question than Daniel's earlier one. More pointed, more intimate. Steve froze. She continued, "You've talked about truth as if it's a duty, a mission, something that shaped you, but you never said what it took from you." Steve swallowed. Hard. For a moment he said nothing. He just stood there, absorbing the question, feeling its edges. Then finally, "It cost me people." The room went still. Steve continued quietly. "People I cared about. People who didn't want to face the truth I had come to accept. People who felt betrayed when I changed. People who preferred who I used to be, not who I've become." His voice grew softer. "It cost me stability. It cost me certainty. It cost me comfort." Then, after a pause, "But it gave me myself." Daniel inhaled sharply, visibly affected. "And," Steve added, "it gave me moments like this. Moments when truth doesn't divide people, but brings them together." The room shifted again, not with tension, but with something warmer. But before Steve could say anything more, the confident woman from earlier spoke again. "Then let me ask the last question," she said. Steve nodded for her to continue. She took a breath. "What happens when the truth changes?" The room froze. Steve felt his pulse jump, because this question, this one, wasn't philosophical. It wasn't emotional. It was explosive, and everyone knew it. Steve looked at her, eyes sharpening. "Then," he said slowly, "we change with it." The woman narrowed her eyes. "And if we can't?" Steve paused. Then the truth leaves us behind." A ripple, almost like a shockwave, moved through the room. And then another voice rose, a voice Steve did not expect, one that would shift the entire conversation. "Daniel." He stepped forward, expression unreadable. "Steve," he said softly. "Yes?" Daniel took a breath. "Then let me ask the question you've been avoiding since this began." Steve stiffened. "The question," Daniel said, "that will finally tell us who you really are." The room braced itself. Daniel's voice cut through the silence. "What truth are you still afraid to face?" The question hit the room like a storm-breaking crack of thunder. And Steve felt the ground shift beneath him, because there was an answer, a real one, a painful one, and he knew the moment had finally arrived, the moment he could no longer hide from. Steve stood there in silence. The director's words still echoed in his head, but the room reacted instantly. A wave of murmurs, shock, confusion, and something like curiosity. I watched Steve swallow hard, as if trying to push the moment back down his throat. But it was too late. The answer had landed, and everyone felt the impact. Steve raised his head slowly. Narrator. And for the first time since the argument began, he didn't look angry. He looked aware. The director stepped back, giving Steve room, physical and emotional, as if saying, "I said it. Do what you want now." A few producers leaned forward in their chairs, not because they wanted drama, but because they sensed a shift, an opening, a crack in the wall Steve had built around himself. He finally spoke. "Why didn't anyone tell me this earlier?" His voice wasn't sharp. It wasn't defensive. It was almost vulnerable. The director smiled softly, the kind of smile that comes from someone who's known you longer than your own excuses. "I did tell you, Steve, many times, but you weren't ready to listen." Steve didn't argue. He didn't push back. He just stood there, breathing slow, trying to absorb everything he had ignored for months. Then the director added, "Today, you finally heard." The room fell silent again, but this time, it wasn't tense. It was expectant. Steve looked down at his hands shaking just a little. He wasn't a man who liked to show weakness, but everyone saw it, and, strangely, it made him more human, more real. The silence stretched, until Steve finally lifted his head and said, "Then tell me what I should do. Not a retreat, not surrender, but a genuine request, a moment of clarity from a man who had been fighting the wrong battles for too long." The director stepped closer. "Start by listening, not reacting, not defending, just listening." Steve nodded, a small gesture, but in that room it felt like a seismic event. The producers exchanged quick glances. This was the Steve they'd been hoping to see again. Then the director added quietly, "And trust us, we're not your enemies." The moment landed like a soft hammer. Painful, but necessary. Steve's voice cracked slightly as he answered, "Okay, I hear you." The director smirked, gently joking. Finally, a ripple of quiet laughter crossed the room, easing the tension without breaking the seriousness of the moment. I watched Steve inhale deeply, a long breath, the kind a man takes before choosing a different road. He looked around the room. For the first time, I feel like I'm not alone in this. No one spoke. They simply nodded, supportive, present, ready. Steve blinked a few times, processing the director's earlier words that had stunned him into silence. And then, with a slightly trembling voice, he added, I think that answer saved me." The director placed a hand on Steve's shoulder. "No," he said softly. "You saved yourself. You just needed to hear the right thing at the right moment." The room exhaled as one. The tension that had defined the argument was gone, evaporated like steam after a storm. Steve wiped a hand across his face, lowering his shoulders. And that was the moment, the precise moment. Everyone realized the argument hadn't broken him. It had changed him. The room stayed quiet, not the uncomfortable kind of silence, but the kind that settles after a storm has passed, a silence that lets everyone breathe again. Steve looked around slowly, as if seeing the team for the first time in months, not as opponents, not as obstacles, but as people who genuinely wanted him to succeed. He took a few steps toward the long table where the producers sat. Each footstep sounded different now, less forceful, more grounded. "Let's start over," Steve said calmly. No tension, no strain, just sincerity. One of the senior producers leaned forward, surprised by the shift. "Start over. How?" she asked. Steve hesitated for a moment. Then he answered, "By admitting when I'm wrong, and by actually listening when someone talks to me." You could practically feel the shock ripple through the room. This wasn't the Steve who had walked in earlier. This was someone evolving. Another producer cleared his throat. "So, what exactly did you hear today, Steve?" Steve took a deeper breath. His eyes drifted toward the director, the man whose unexpected answer had shattered the argument's momentum. "I heard," Steve said slowly, "that my fear has been running this project, not me." The entire room froze. Even the air felt still. Fear. The word hung there, bold and unmistakable. Steve continued, "I've been arguing because I thought I was protecting something important. But really, I was protecting my ego, my pride, and I didn't even realize how loud that had become." The admission stunned everyone, including me. For a man like Steve, ego wasn't just a trait. It was a shield, a fortress, and now he was lowering it in front of the entire team. The director nodded, his voice soft but steady. "That's the real turning point, Steve. Owning the fear." Steve exhaled shakily. "I hate it," he confessed, "but I'm tired of pretending it's not there." One of the newer writers raised her hand timidly. Her voice was gentle. "Steve, what exactly were you afraid of?" Steve didn't hesitate. "Failing in front of people who expect more from me." He spoke with a painful honesty, a rawness that no one in the room had seen from him before. He continued, slow and measured. "I kept thinking that if I argued hard enough, if I pushed back on every suggestion, I could hide the fact that I felt lost." His words echoed through the studio like a truth finally set free. The writer lowered her hand, her eyes soft with understanding. "You don't have to hide that." Steve gave a small, grateful nod. The director walked closer to him. "Steve, fear doesn't make you weak. Refusing to face it does, and today, you faced it." Steve's lips parted slightly, almost a smile, almost not. "I didn't expect your answer," Steve admitted. "It hit me harder than anything anyone said during this entire argument." The director replied, "Because it wasn't meant to win the argument. It was meant to reach you." Steve swallowed. "Well, it did." The room shifted again, not uneasy, not tense, but united. It felt like everyone had stepped with him into a new space, a room where arguments weren't walls, but doorways. Steve turned toward the group again. "I think I'm ready," he said. "Ready to hear your ideas, ready to rebuild this project together, ready to stop pretending I have to carry everything on my own." A senior editor spoke up. "Steve, you never had to carry it alone. You just didn't trust us enough to help." Steve nodded slowly. "That changes today." The director smiled. "Then let's begin." He gestured toward the main storyboard on the wall, the same board that had sparked the argument in the first place. But now, instead of tension, the room filled with a different energy. Hope, focus, collaboration. Steve approached the board and placed his hand on the top edge. The director stood beside him. "So," Steve said quietly, "what's the first step?" The director answered, "Listening, really listening, and then shaping the vision together." Steve nodded again. "I can do that." The producers exchanged small smiles. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it wasn't explosive, but it was real, authentic, a moment of genuine transformation, and everyone there felt it. Steve took another deep breath, the kind a man takes when he's ready to rebuild something important. Not just the project, but himself. "All right," he said softly. "Show me where we went wrong." The director stepped closer to the board. "Okay," he said. "Let's go through it from the top." And for the first time all day, Steve listened, really listened. The room felt different now, calmer, steadier, as if the storm that had shaken everyone finally cleared the sky above them. The director stood beside Steve, pointing to the first sequence on the storyboard. The producers leaned in. Writers opened their notebooks again. Everyone, after hours of tension, was finally working as one. Steve watched the director's hand trace the outline of the key scene. He didn't interrupt. He didn't push back. He simply absorbed every word. After a moment, he asked quietly, "Why didn't I see this before?" The director answered just as quietly, "Because you were looking for control instead of clarity." Steve exhaled slowly. "I guess clarity scares me more than conflict." "That's normal," the director said. "But conflict without clarity leads nowhere." Steve nodded, understanding more deeply now than he had at any point in the project. The room moved through the ideas, one by one. The writers added insights. The producers refined pacing and tone. The director shaped the emotional arc. And Steve participated, not as a dictator, not as a man defending every inch, but as someone finally open to growth. His voice, when he offered input, was calm, measured, purposeful. After nearly an hour of this new, balanced collaboration, the director turned to him. "You see the difference now?" Steve looked around the room, at the team he had fought with, pushed away, doubted, and finally understood. "Yeah," he said softly. "I do. When I stop fighting everyone, everything starts to make sense." The director gave a warm, relieved smile. "That's the Steve we've been waiting for." A quiet laugh moved through the room, not mocking, not triumphant, just human. Steve allowed himself a small smile, too, and then, as if compelled by something deeper, he stepped back and addressed the entire team. "I owe all of you an apology." The room went still again. Steve continued, his voice steady but emotional. "I pushed too hard. I argued because I was afraid. Afraid to lose control. Afraid to be wrong. Afraid to disappoint you." He glanced around the room. "But today, you showed me something I didn't expect." He paused. "That I'm not alone, and I don't have to pretend to be." The writers exchanged glances, touched. The producers nodded. Even the director's eyes softened. One of the editors said gently, "We just want to build something great with you, Steve. Not against you." Steve's throat tightened for a moment. "I know," he said. "And starting now, I'm ready to let that happen." The director stepped forward, offering his hand. "Then let's finish this project the right way. Together." Steve took his hand and shook it firmly. The handshake wasn't symbolic. It was real, earned, deserved. The room burst with quiet energy, the kind that comes when a team finally feels aligned, finally feels understood. And then the director said the words that closed the chapter, "All right, team, let's rewrite the last act." But Steve raised a hand slightly. "Wait." Everyone stopped. Steve looked at the storyboard, then at the team, then at the director. "I think," he said, "we need one more thing before we rewrite anything." The director lifted a brow. "And what's that?" Steve smiled. Simple, genuine, the first true smile of the day. "A fresh start." The director grinned. "Now that," he said, "we can do." Laughter filled the room. Warm, light, healing. A sound that washed away the earlier tension like sunlight melting frost. The argument that had once threatened to break the team had instead brought them closer. And Steve, The man who had entered the room ready to explode left the moment transformed, not because someone defeated him, but because someone reached him, and in front of everyone, he made the choice that shocked the entire room far more than any argument ever could. He changed. As the team gathered around him, ready to begin anew, Steve whispered to himself, just loud enough for me to hear, "That answer was exactly what I needed." And for the first time all day, he truly meant it. The room went silent. Silence earned. A silence shared. A silence that marked the beginning of something better.